This edition of Mac Voices is supported by MacVoices magazine, our free Flipboard magazine that brings you some of the best Mac, iPhone, and iPad productivity tips on the web. High in signal, low in noise, just like MacVoices, MacVoices magazine includes information on how you can get more out of your Apple technology. Subscribe at macvoices.com/magazine or search for MacVoices magazine in Flipboard on your iPad or iPhone. Welcome to Mac Notables on Mac Voices. This is a talk of the Mac community. I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we have Mr. Ted Landau back, the man of few words. Ted, it's great to see you.
Man of few words? Why is that?
It's because whenever I email you and say, are we going to do the show at Tuesday at whatever time, you send back yes. That's it. Just not how you doing, not what's going on, not what we're going to talk about. Yes.
Well, you ask a yes or no question, you get a yes or no answer, I think.
Okay. How very analog of you. Oh, man. So we haven't talked since Apple's media event, the second media event, more accurately. Yes. And I'm kind of curious to see, because the last time you were here, I think you did a few predictions, expressed a couple opinions. How did you do? How do you think you did compared to the way they delivered?
Well, I think the predictions that we made was both of us in a sense, I guess, but you're not taking responsibility for your part of the predictions there. But we did very well. I'll give you credit anyway. I think we pretty much nailed it. I said they were going to come out with an iMac with Retina display, and they did. I said there'd be, as I recall, they'd be pretty sure there'd be an updated iMac Mini, Mac Mini, and there was certainly a new iPad 2, iPad Air 2, and there was. I said there most likely wouldn't be any update to the MacBooks, and there weren't. So overall, I think I came, I don't remember exactly the wording I used in some of those cases, but I'd say we were probably better than 90% on our predictions. So.
Wonder if we can do that going forward.
Well, it becomes a little easier when you ask me what I predict like 2 days before the event, because by that point, the rumor mill has sort of converged enough that if I read a little bit between the lines, that I can pretty much guess what's likely to happen. If you'd asked me a month or two before, I'm sure I wouldn't have done nearly as well.
Yeah, that's probably true too. The one thing that still sticks out from the event, Ted, is the iPad Mini. Mm-hmm. That we didn't see a little more parity with it with the iPad Air 2. It just didn't get that much, and in fact, it got so little presentation time. It was almost an afterthought, it seemed. Mm-hmm. Is that a surprise given the iPhone 6 Plus and the iPad Air? That is the iPad Mini not long for this world?
Oh, I think the iPad Mini is going to be around. No, I don't think they're going to get rid of it anytime soon. There's very little cost to them maintaining it, I think, and as long as it's the only reason they would get rid of it is if sales dropped so far over the cliff that there was no point in maintaining it. But as long as there's a decent amount of sales, I think they'll keep it going. I frankly was a bit surprised. I thought last year it was absolutely great. I talked about this in the column that I wrote afterwards, that the iPad Mini and the iPad Air had identical internal specs. The only difference between the two was the size of the display. And so it made it very easy to try to figure out which one you wanted. You want a bigger one, you get the iPad Air. You want a smaller one, you get the iPad Mini. That's the end of it. There was no reason to say, well, I'd like the iPad Mini, but the iPad Air has the blah 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 blah, and so on. And that was great. And the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus are almost that way. I mean, there are those those little differences. The iPad 6, the iPhone 6 Plus has the image optical stabilization and the better battery life. And some people find those to be significant. But for most people, I think the i6 and the 6 Plus are close enough that once again, the deciding factor is going to be the size and not much else. And I like that. I think that's great. And then for some reason, Apple decided, after having established that precedent pretty much with the latest iPhones and the previous generation of iPads, to significantly stray from that for the iPads this time around. And pretty much not update the iPad Mini at all. It added Touch ID, which was significant, but but that's it, basically. And that allowed it to have some compatibility with Apple Pay, too, so I guess you could throw that in there. But all the other changes that Apple made, the improved cameras, the improved way that the screen is fused to the glass, the faster processor, I don't remember, the fact that it's thinner and lighter, whatever, all the changes that Apple made to the iPad Air 2 were omitted from the Mini. And I'm not sure why. I've read and thought about reasons why. That one reason people have suggested is that they're, like you were suggesting, that maybe with the iPhone 6 Plus, that the iPad Mini is essentially caught in a crossfire. People want a big screen, get the iPad Air. People want a little screen, are now finding that the iPhone 6 Plus is a better alternative than the Mini, and so the Mini's a bit caught in a crossfire, which it might be a little bit, but still, I don't see why that means you couldn't. It's hard for me to imagine that it would have been that difficult once you've updated all the internals on the iPad Air 2 to transfer that to the iPad Mini, and so it's certain to. I think there's no way of getting around that it will hurt, I think, sales of the iPad Mini, because there will be people who would have gotten an iPad Mini if the specs had been updated who now won't. And so, for whatever reason, Apple is saying it's okay that the sales of the Mini are going to be hurt by this.
I guess it doesn't surprise me that Apple's a business. We all know that. And Apple wants to push you toward the bigger, more expensive product. Mm. This one seemed to be a little bit surprising to the degree at which they did it. But like the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 6 Plus, well, aside from the screen, they gave you one big reason to push to the 6 Plus, and that is the optical stabilization, if you are into the camera. So there's always a differentiating factor, and I felt like that might be it, that maybe they wanted a lot more of a differentiation between the Mini and the Air, or the Mini. Let's see, is the Mini 3 and the Air 2, so that you clearly had a choice, a decision to make, not a choice, but a decision to make. I know there are a lot of users that would prefer to have parity as far as features, but I'm not sure that they see it that way as a business.
I don't see why it would necessarily hurt their business, to be honest. I mean, just because the iPad Mini is cheaper doesn't mean they make less money. I mean, the iPhone is cheaper than either of them, and most of their revenue comes from the iPhone now. So their profit margins could be similar between the iPad Mini and the iPad Air. So just because it's smaller and slightly cheaper doesn't mean it's less interest to them from a business perspective per se. So I'm not sure that explains it to me. And they clearly. I mean, I think what you're doing a little bit, I fear, is sort of this ex post facto explanation. In other words, last year Apple had parity. This year they don't. So last year, if we were sitting here talking, you'd be presumably explaining to me why it makes sense for them to have parity. This year you're explaining to me why it makes sense that they don't have parity. I mean, it's like you look at what Apple does and then come up with a rational explanation for why it makes sense. Or, well, maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe sometimes Apple does something that doesn't strike you as appealing to common sense, and this could be one of them.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's absolutely a fair point. I got to believe that the only thing I'm not sure Apple doesn't do things for no real reason. So somewhere there's a statistic, there's a supply chain issue, there's a production issue, there's something that made them to make this decision, because they certainly, again, they bounced right over the Mini. I mean, they barely mentioned it.
Oh, yeah.
And so, they probably wouldn't have mentioned it if they hadn't done something. Or if they would have mentioned it more if they'd done something interesting. But there's something somewhere. We'll find out about it in 5 or 10 years.
I'm sure if you could interview Tim Cook and get an honest answer, that he would offer some reason why he did it. They're just not telling you what that reason is. And it might be a very good reason. I'm not suggesting that Apple doesn't have any good reason. I'm just saying we don't clearly, or at least you and I, presumably, don't clearly know what that reason is. And I'm somewhat at a loss to come up with a good reason. That doesn't mean there isn't one. I've often be at a loss. But it's hard for me to imagine why it wouldn't have been nice for them and perhaps just as profitable for them to do it. The other thing I'd add about that, and this actually also drifts into the iMac situation, is that when you look at their iPad lineup now, it's a bit odd. You have the iPad Air 2 at the top, clearly a new updated machine for 2014. And then you have the iPad Mini, which is basically a 2013 machine with a very minor change, the Touch ID. And then you have Apple continuing to sell 3 previous year models of iPad. They're selling the original, they're still continuing to sell the original iPad Air, the original iPad Mini, and I believe that they're selling an iPad Air, as I recall, even older than an iPad even older than the iPad Air. They're selling like essentially 3 generations ago of iPad. And so if you look at their iPad lineup, they are selling 5 iPads today, only one of which really represents a 2014 model. So the majority of the iPads, just on a catalog listing basis, 4 out of the 5 iPads really aren't very new, if you went to Apple Store to buy one. And oddly enough, and this was part of the point of the article I wrote, which was called How Odd, that if you look at the iMac situation, it's pretty much the same thing. That is, they introduced this iMac with Retina display at a substantial price, which we can talk about. It's kind of interesting. And then they're continuing to sell the previous iMacs, which are pretty much unchanged since 2012. And I think there might have been a minor speed bump between 2012 and today, but that's basically it. And so essentially, if you go to the Apple Store to look for an iMac, you see one 2014 model and models that date back several years ago. There seems to be a message there that says maybe the need to overhaul our hardware every year or two is getting less and less, and that we can get by on hardware that's 2-3 years old and still do quite well.
A lot of responses to that. There are obviously economies that they have been able to develop with these machines. So selling them either at a lower price or maybe the same price with the display, they can get the profit margins they need. The more people I talk to, Ted, everybody's looking for a new killer app that demands a new machine. Mm-hmm. And the new iMac, it's a nice machine. The screen is fantastic. I haven't seen one, but you got to believe that a 5K iMac is fantastic. Mm-hmm. That's the part that everybody sees. It's like, you buy a stereo and you spend hopefully more money on the speakers. Mm-hmm. Than the receiver or anything else. Mm-hmm. So this was a logical thing for them to do. They figured out a way to do it, and maybe that's where they needed to spend the money to keep it at that magic $24.99 or $24.95, whatever price point.
Yeah, I'm just saying that Apple seems to have reversed their previous way of approaching the catalog. I mean, this is certainly not the first time that they've continued to sell an out-of-date model at a reduced price, and not suggesting it is. But my clear recollection is in the past, that would usually be sort of the afterthought. In other words, if you went to see what Apple had, they would say, well, here's our brand new line of iMacs. There's the iMac this, the iMac that, the iMac this. They're all new. Oh, and if you want to spend less money, we have last year's iMac that you can still get. But now you look, and it's almost the opposite. Here are all our iMacs. It's last year, it's last year, it's last year, it's last. Oh, and if you want a new one, we have this one over here. And so this sort of the emphasis has shifted. And there's one new one and a bunch of old ones instead of all new ones and one old one. And it's just interesting. I'm not sure it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's both for the iPad and the iMac. It represents something I think that's significantly different than the way Apple has operated before.
Do you think it's a new environment? Well, of course it's a new environment, but it's an environment where they're hitting competitors at a lot of different price points and feature points. I mean, the iPad Air is still, I think, a status machine. It's a fantastic machine, mm-hmm. but it's a status machine. The 5K iMac is a bit of a status machine. Fantastic mm-hmm. machine, but still mm-hmm. a status machine. But now, so instead of doing the race to the bottom, where you try to introduce lesser models. Mm-hmm. just maintain older models that compete quite nicely with some of the other things that are out there.
Yeah. I mean, it was a cost saving for them for sure. Why come out with a new low-end model when last year's model can serve as the low-end model? I guess that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, and they sort of did what you're talking about with the 5C.
Mm-hmm.
They pretty much wrapped the 5 in the iPhone. Excuse me, the iPhone 5.
Mm-hmm.
In colored plastic, and said, okay, here's the 5C,
Mm-hmm.
and that drew not criticism, but that drew comments.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a very viable strategy. There was a little differentiation going there, and it also put an affordable iPhone in the hands of more people.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And now you can get one for free, I think, is the
Yeah.
current subsidized price.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also brings to my mind just the idea that how much more can they push the specs of the screen or the processor?
Well, that's what I'm getting. I think we're near a point, perhaps, unless some hardware breakthrough occurs, that we've plateaued a lot. I mean, you look at TVs. TVs got to be about as good as they were going to get this iteration. Right now, they have the 4K TVs and the curved screens, and they're trying to make a selling point of that. I'm not sure how successful that will be as a big deal. 3D didn't make it, but basically, you had 1080p televisions, flat screen televisions, and I mean, for several years, they weren't much. Each year wasn't much better than the year before, at least for the average consumer. You couldn't tell a 2012 TV from a 2013 TV, or for most people, you'd have to look at a spec sheet to see what the differences are. And I think maybe we're getting, temporarily anyway, getting to that point with computers as well. There was something else I wanted to say about the iMac. I want to get back to the iMac if you want to go there. The couple of interesting things about the iMac. First, it's approaching a point where, well, I don't know if I'm saying you're actually getting into territory where it almost overlaps with the Mac Pro, at least the cheapest Mac Pro. Certainly, you can get a decked out Mac Pro, but I priced out the iMac with upping all the specs. Went from the i5 to the i7 processor. Went for the either for the 3 terabyte Fusion drive or the 1 terabyte flash drive, up to the graphic processor. Maxed out the RAM at 32 gigabytes, and really decked out iMac, and it came to over $4,000. So for $4,000, you could get a Mac Pro and a monitor. And have something that is comparable. So that's a pretty expensive machine, but you wouldn't. And the interesting thing is, with the Mac Pro, you couldn't get a monitor from Apple as nice as the one that comes with the iMac. And so, in some sense, I could see people preferring an iMac over a Mac Pro these days if they wanted the 5K monitor. And it's an interesting juncture with the pricing that Apple has put for the iMac. The other thing I'd say about the Mac upgrades in that regard is the Mac Mini, which I was really disappointed with on a personal level. I mean, they did upgrade the Mac Mini, but they seem to go out of their way to suggest that we don't want you to think, by any stretch of the imagination, that this is a computer for anybody except somebody who just woke up to discover that computers existed yesterday. They kept emphasizing that this is for a first-time buyer, this is for somebody who might be going from a PC to a Mac or whatever. And I, of course, was hoping for something a bit different. We've talked about this before, and I'll just briefly go through it again. I have a 2009 Mac Pro that I'm still using. In fact, I'm using it right now to talk to you. And it's getting to the point, and we can talk when we talk about Yosemite. I'll tell you why it's getting to that point sooner rather than later. But it's getting to that point where I want to upgrade to a new machine. And I have decided I don't want to get a new Mac Pro because it's just overkill for me. And so more expensive than I need, and I just didn't want it. And so but I like the Mac Pro that I have now. I like the idea of an independent standalone display, some degree of flexibility for the internal hardware, and so on. And so what I would have liked was for Apple to come out with a Mac Mini and say a 5K standalone display, which I understand there can be technical problems for, but let's ignore that for the moment. And have a decent Mac Mini that the Mac Mini is every bit as good as the iMac. Essentially, they take the internals of the iMac and all the ports that are on the iMac and duplicate it into the Mac Mini. Maybe even make it a little better, whatever. And then add a 5K independent display, and I'd probably get that over an iMac, because I would like the flexibility. I like the idea that if I that one thing, it would allow me to upgrade to a new Mac Mini in a year or two without having to replace the display, which you can't do with an iMac. And for that expensive display, I'm not sure I'd want to keep replacing a new one every year or 2 or 3 years. So that's what I was hoping. And instead, I got almost the opposite. The new Mac Mini is as close to a downgrade as Apple will ever come. I mean, there are some ways in which it was improved, but as people pointed out, and I even wasn't immediately aware, they got rid of the quad-core option. Now it's just dual core as a possibility. They soldered the RAM, whereas last time around it was removable RAM. I think there's one or two other changes that they made that made it significantly down from the prior Mac Mini. And so rather than tempting me to get a Mac Mini as a sort of in between an iMac and a Mac Pro replacement, I pretty much dismissed the Mac Mini altogether. Apple's convinced me. I didn't wake up to computers yesterday. I'm not part of the target audience for the Mac Mini. So I'm back to really the only Mac. If the Mac Mini is too minimalist and the Mac Pro too expensive, the only choice I have for a desktop machine is an iMac. That's pretty much it now. It's an iMac or nothing. And since I'm not going to be that interested in getting an iMac that's 2 years old, really it comes down to the Retina display. If I were to get a new Mac tomorrow, that's what I would get. And I'm not sure I'd be totally happy with it, but that's what I would get.
The Mini has been, there's been so much controversy, I guess, surrounding it. It's interesting to hear you talk about it, though, as anticipating being able to position it between an iMac and a Mac Pro. I guess I never really expected that. I would have expected something a little more upgradable, that maybe to get as a second Mac. And of course, the older Mac Minis have long been used as servers, and that's been a big popular thing. They got rid of the server package for it. But I still see it as it maybe a little bit lesser entry-level Mac for PC people who are saying, well, I'd like to try this. I already have the monitor. I already have the keyboard. I already have the mouse. So I'll get this little box, plug it in, and see if I like it. Mm-hmm. And that, it would seem to serve that market well. It's not going to be a super great experience, but it's going to get people into the Apple ecosystem. That said, I wish they would have at least given you the option to beef it up a little bit so it could become the little monster machine that we all wanted, even if it cost a little bit more.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive, is my point. Apple could have an entry-level Mac Mini that does exactly what you're suggesting, which would be great, and which it does. And they could have a custom build upgrade or a series of steps of upgrades that eventually get to where I want it to be. I'm not saying I expected them to do this. They have never done it in the past, so I guess if I had to lay money on it, I would have expected that they wouldn't do it. But I was sort of hoping that they would, and was disappointed that they didn't. Not only didn't they even move in that direction, but they moved farther away. So any hope that I might have ever had that the Mac Mini would be a machine I would want to buy is pretty much eliminated with this upgrade. It will never be something I want to buy.
So are you seriously lusting after a new machine, or is it just you think time to get a new machine, or where do you stand with actually making that jump?
Well, I think I'm going to hold on to the 2009 Mac Pro for a while longer. I believe the 5K screen is appealing to me. I've often said, maybe even on this show, I have a Mac Pro with Retina. I have a MacBook Pro with Retina display, and every time I use it and come back to my desktop Mac, I go, "Oh, what's wrong with this display?" The Retina display is unbelievable, and text looks like it was written with ink on the screen. There's just no way to describe it other than that. And if you've seen it, you know what I mean. And then the pixelation on I have a 24-inch cinema display that I'm looking at right now, and it looks fine most of the time until I look at the MacBook for a while, and then I come back and say, "Oh, what a piece of crap this is." And so, yeah, the idea of having something that good as my default desktop display is quite appealing, and that's getting me to think about getting it. And this can drift us into the next topic. I upgraded my Mac Pro to Yosemite, and that was a whole different experience. I upgraded the MacBook Pro to Yosemite a while back with the developer version, and it went very smoothly. had no problems with it. I updated the Mac Pro and have had all sorts of problems, which I think ultimately many of them are due to third-party conflicts, and also I think due to legacy software. If the Mac Pro, even though it's a 2009 Mac Pro, in some sense, it's a 1999 machine, because really, I have, well, since Mac OS X came out, let's put that, which I think was in 2001. Let's go back that far. Since I started using Mac OS X back in 2001, I have been upgrading my machine every time and not starting with a clean install. And so I might have some files, since the software updater doesn't go and necessarily clean out every unused, unwanted, legacy, deprecated, whatever file that's in the system. I can have files sitting around in my system folders, library folders from 2001, 2002 that I don't need anymore. I could have tens of thousands of those files for all I know, and no clear way to go about finding them all and deleting them. And at some point, I think the weight of all that bloated, unnecessary software begins to take a toll, and you see something like I had, where my 2009 machine, which I said has a legacy all the way back to 2001, is having problems, where my MacBook Pro, which I actually did start with a clean install back in 2012, is performing a lot better.
So I want to make sure I got it straight. So the Mac Pro is doing okay, but the MacBook Pro is not?
The MacBook Pro is doing just fine.
Yeah, and that's sort of what I would have expected.
MacBook Pro, which is a new machine, got it in late 2012, I believe, or maybe early 2013, and did a clean install, and so there's really no legacy software in there, and it took the upgrade to Yosemite just fine. My Mac Pro, the desktop machine, which is a 2009 machine, which still retains all the legacy software that I've ever used, has had a much more difficult time.
Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me. I know Joe Kissel was here, and we talked about some of the testing he was doing, and he said, basically on all his test machines, if he installed just Yosemite, clean, ran like a champ. But as soon as you start introducing legacy, older software, other software, you start to have potential instabilities, and that's just, I guess, the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
And it feels like more and more it's becoming important to look at the developer instead of just the piece of software. How long are they going to be around, and how dedicated are they to maintaining the software that you're going to depend on?
Yeah. Well, yes, absolutely. And one of the problems I had, actually, while you're talking about third-party developers, which is the one that I wrote about for Bugs and Fixes in Macworld last week, was a doozy that I never saw coming. And I'll just briefly tell you, I upgraded to Yosemite. I deliberately, because my Mac Pro is my work machine. That's where I do all my writing, all my work, based talking to you, like I said. My MacBook, I don't depend on as heavily. So I updated the MacBook Pro with the developer version a while back, figuring if I had problems, so be it. That would be my test machine, so to speak. The Mac Pro, I said, I'm going to wait till it's golden master, till it's released, to make sure that I get the benefit of all the beta testing before I risk it on my main machine. And I did. And so, like a few days after Yosemite was available, I updated, figuring now was a good time, and I hadn't heard any really bad reports from the initial people who had updated, and all went well on the upgrade. Everything was fine. Machine rebooted. I started to use it, and nothing worked. Literally, I could not open an application and have it work. Safari couldn't open web pages. Tweetbot, I couldn't enter new tweets. Could barely scroll to see the old tweets. Outlook, I couldn't get my mail. iTunes wouldn't show me the iTunes store. I tried to take a screen snapshot to show some of the problems I was having, and I got a message that said screenshot failed, unable to take screenshot. I mean, really, and then stuff started actually freezing to the point where I had to force quit things just to get them to work again. I opened system preferences. I was getting no sound whatsoever, so I opened system preferences to go to the sound system preferences. As soon as I clicked the sound system preference, the system preferences entirely crashed. If I didn't do that, I got a spinning beach ball after about 30 seconds and couldn't do anything with it anyway. I mean, I was just going crazy. I was ready to just say, "Oh my God!" But I calmed down. I said, "Okay, I know, potentially it works. I haven't been reading about millions of people complaining. I have a MacBook where it's working just fine. So in theory, I should be able to get this to work." And so I set about to try to figure out what was going on. And I'll let people read the article if they want to know all the details. But eventually I tracked it down after many hours of trial and error. I tracked it down to a file that was installed by Audio Hijack Pro, which I believe you use. Or use. Yeah, it was installed by Auto Hijack Pro, called Instant On Driver, and it was not as if I don't mean to sound complaining to the Ambrosia, the people who do it.
Rogue Amoeba.
Rogue Amiga, yeah, I couldn't remember, get those confused sometimes. I didn't want to sound critical of Rogue Amoeba because they had recognized the problem. Not surprisingly, people probably started writing in as soon as they were using the beta versions, and they released an updated version of Instant On that was compatible with Yosemite. The problem for me was I hardly ever use Audio Hijack Pro anymore. I mean, it's probably been like 6, 7, 8 months since I even launched the app. And so, and I didn't check to see whether there was a new version, and I didn't get any message. Sometimes when you launch an app, it says there's a new version available. Do you want to download it? Well, I didn't get that message because I never launched it. And that would have been fine for most software, because if you're not launching it, you're not going to see the incompatibility. But it turns out that the Instant On software is installed in your library folder and is active even if you never launch Audio Hijack Pro. And so I was seeing the problems without the benefit of launching the app. When I finally removed that file and started again, 90% of the problems went away that I was having. So that lesson learned there. But the 10% that didn't go away the hits just keep on coming. They're just these little things that keep happening. I had a problem that I spent an hour or two on the other day, where I opened up the Notes application on my Mac and found that the syncing between my Notes on the Mac and iCloud was all gone. That essentially my iPhone, my iPad, and my MacBook Pro were all syncing correctly with each other through the iCloud, but everything on my Mac, the identical notes, it had saved those notes, but all the notes that were on my Mac that were duplicated in iCloud were now like standalone versions that had nothing to do with iCloud. So any changes I made on the Mac never made it to iCloud or to the other devices. And it took me several hours to get all that sorted out and get the syncing back working again. It's working now, but essentially I had to delete all those files and copy them over into new versions that were working with iCloud. And today, just as we were trying to get started, I had a minor audio glitch where the audio wasn't coming from the right place. And so things like that some very minor take me a minute or two to fix. Some, like the Notes one, more major, takes me several hours to fix. But it seems like it never ends. I feel like it's going to be weeks before I have everything function as smoothly as I did before I upgraded to Yosemite.
Ted, is it reasonable to expect everything to work at this point, with everything so complex and there's so many little niches and nuances to things? And I'm not trying to be an Apple apologist. I'm trying to ask a legitimate question. Have we just pushed Apple and pushed software developers into developing such complex systems that you almost have to expect some of these things?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's an odd way of phrasing it. Is it reasonable to expect that everything's going to work smoothly? I suppose not. It's very complicated stuff. I expect most things to work smoothly. That was the whole point of a beta testing period that Apple went through. So I expected most of the problems would get discovered during beta testing and get fixed. And in the case of the Instant On driver that I had a problem with, it was discovered during the beta testing and did get fixed. So right. It's partially my fault. But a lot of the other problems I'm having, like why Notes wasn't syncing properly, I mean, that's entirely Apple software as far as I know. And I have no idea why I had that problem. And a lot of the problems have been like that. And yeah, I don't. I expect there to be problems, but the other interesting aspect of it, talking to my wife about it a little bit, is regardless of whether you expect them to happen or whether they're inevitable or not, some of these things are really difficult to fix on your own. I mean, I'm trying to imagine somebody other than myself, like my wife, say, if my wife was using my Mac Pro as her main computer and I wasn't around to assist her, if these problems developed, there's no way that she or almost anybody else would have been able to diagnose and fix these problems. Well, it sounds like I'm touting my horn too much, but I'm being frank. Most people would not be capable of figuring out what was going on and fixing it on their own. They'd have to have to take it into the Apple Store, or call tech support, or both, or do something, and it'd be a major deal. And so, it's just unfortunate if those things are going to happen. That people are going to confront all these problems that they have no idea how to fix.
It's a good reason to tap into certain resources that advertise these, or not advertise, publicize these things, and some of the solutions. I mean, there are so many great Mac sites out there that do it. Sometimes just finding the right keywords to find the problem you're having. Sometimes it's very easy. Sometimes it's very difficult. Actually, in that regard, I did try to Google search on my audio on that big Instant On problem that I was having. And Instant On never came up as a suggested cause of the problem. And I did about a half a dozen Google searches. So it doesn't always work. But it used to be a good site called MacFixit that worked on these sort of things. I think I heard of that.
Yeah. Not around it.
So at this point, would you tell what we might call the average pardon me, what we might call the average user to go ahead and upgrade and just deal with a couple of the fixes, or do you think it's time to wait for another point or half point release to fix some of this? I'd
say it's up. For most cases, I'd say update. That a lot of the problems that I'm having, I think, are not scheduled to be fixed in a 0.1 update. That the Instant On problem, for instance, that's not going to be fixed in a 0.1 update. You have to know to replace the Instant On driver, and that'll be true today. It'll be true tomorrow. So until you figure that out, you're going to have that problem. And I think most users who are using relatively new hardware without a lot of legacy software should be just fine. So if you got a Mac, say in 2010 or later, last 4 or 5 years, and I suspect that you'll have a relatively smooth sailing. If you have an older Mac that goes back with legacy software, even older than that, then you're more likely to have problems.
Okay.
And several people, I should have pointed out, not always realistically in my view, in some comments to my article, one person said, that's why you should disable or get rid of all software on your Mac that didn't come from the Mac App Store before you upgrade. And I'm going, well, I don't think so. Or check every one of them, at the minimum, check every one of them to make sure there isn't an update available before you upgrade. Then you would have avoided this problem. And, well, I only have several hundred programs like that. It's not practical for me to check every one of them. I don't even know for sure every one of them unless I start looking. I'm certainly not going to get rid of all of them. So, but certainly I think the lesson on the other side is the less that you depend upon software that is not from the Mac App Store and that may be years old, the less likely you are to have problems. I think that's true.
Yeah. This edition of Mac Voices could have been sponsored by you. Mac Voices is always looking for sponsors who appreciate our high-signal, low-noise approach to tech topics with an Apple focus. Our sponsorship packages feature inclusion in all of the audio and video versions of Mac Voices at all of their distribution points, a web presence, inclusion in the Mac Voices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter, and more. Get the details by contacting me at chuck@macvoices.com or contact Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Okay, so the big discussion that is hot right now for lots of reasons, and that is Apple Pay.
Mm-hmm.
And especially the fact that some vendors are seeing fit to turn off Apple Pay.
CVS and Rite Aid. Those are some vendors.
Those are some vendors. Okay. So I wasn't going to call any names, but since you did, that's fine. First of all, how have you found the Apple Pay experience?
I found it to be great. It was a little awkward the first time I tried it. There should be a place where you can go to practice. So you can get the hang. Like it's the first time I've ever tried to use NFC at all. And so at first I wondered, do I have to hold the iPhone screen towards the NFC device, or can I hold it with the back towards the NFC device? Will it work just as well? And then there was a whole way of using my finger to do a Touch ID to confirm that it's me. Do I do it in sequence, or can I do them simultaneously, and all that sort of. So there's a little bit of fumbling around the first time or two as I try different variations on how to do it to see what works and doesn't work. But once you get the hang of it, it was super. I mean, essentially, I think I said on Twitter, I put the iPhone near the NFC hardware at the store, and then the sales cashier handed me a receipt. That was it. I mean, everything else was handled by the iPhone and the server software, presumably at Apple's end. It couldn't have been easier. So it was really, one of those, okay, the future has arrived. Here we are. And I'm not sure what was less convenient about alternatives that were around before Apple Pay, because I've never tried any of them, to be honest with you. Or to be not honest with you, I've never tried any of them too. But certainly Apple Pay was as convenient as I could imagine it being. I can't imagine how you can make the process more smooth and convenient than Apple Pay is. And so if user experience is going to be a defining characteristic that will determine the success or failure of these devices, Apple Pay is headed for a big success as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the one thing that, because I've had a very similar experience to you. Just you go in. I was at Panera Bread when I did my first one, and it's like, bang! You almost were waiting for something, a little flashing light or something, a little confetti coming down, and it's just no, it's done, it's over, move on, and that's exactly what you would want.
Yeah, and I think the cashier had no idea. Then they don't have to. I mean, that's one of the good. I felt like, hey, I just use Apple Pay. Cool, huh? And the cashier, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. 2 more hours till I get off shift.
But,
so, Ted, listen, I'm the last one that wants to call for a boycott of anybody. But at the same time, the whole currency, and that's currency with a capital C at the end, it feels like somebody's fighting the future, that they're trying to resist the trend, and the problem with it, at least for me, and I'm still trying to figure out why it bothers me quite the way it does. I used to think that Rite Aid and CVS were in the drugstore business. Now I find out they're in the information business, and that really suddenly bothers me. And I'm the guy that likes Gmail, so I don't have a problem with certain parts of my life being data mined, but this one, just because it's not a stated thing of theirs, really did bother me.
Yeah, it bothered me too. I mean, I try to be understanding of it, and I think there are a couple of things. And one is they have a legitimate gripe against credit card companies that take a 3 to 5% or something transaction fee on all their transactions. And part of what they're hoping to accomplish with this currency is to bypass credit cards altogether. Now, the Apple Pay system, to be clear, still depends on credit cards, which is why MasterCard and Visa are promoting them. Essentially, you enter your credit card information into the iPhone. Whereas this currency, as I understand it, and again, I haven't used it. In fact, it's not even really available yet to be used, so nobody's used it. That the currency is going to be independent of credit cards. It will function directly. And so they will save money, and also they will, as you're saying, be able to data mine the information that would normally go to the credit card. They'll get that information now. In fact, they'll be able to track purchases across apparently all the stores, retail chains that support currency. So if you buy something at Rite Aid, CVS will know about it, and so on. And I can see where all that would be valuable to them, and I can see where they would like that and prefer it. There are two problems. One is I don't think, from what I've heard, that the system is going to be nearly as smooth as Apple's. It depends upon a QR code, as I recall, and they don't have Apple's designers thinking about Apple's design. I mean, one of the things I said is Apple, and maybe I'm being a little naively kind to Apple here, but my feeling is Apple puts the user first. The reason it puts the user first is because that's how it makes money. And it's putting money first, ultimately. It is a business. If I'm pleased, then I'm going to buy their products and use their products. And I will say to you, you should buy an Apple product. Look how cool it is. Look how well it works. And so their allegiance is to me, in a sense, because I'm how they turn a profit. Whereas CBS doesn't, and Rite Aid and Walmart and all those people, I don't think have that same perspective. They view it as their allegiance is to their stores, and their allegiance and the user experience is of secondary issue. Their feeling is, well, all these people who have their reward cards with CBS and Walmart and so on will want to continue to use them, and if our currency system is the only way they continue to use them, then they'll use them. They'll grumble about what a crappy user experience is, but they'll use them anyway. It doesn't really matter. And so I resent that a little bit, and I prefer the Apple approach better. And so I view that as an issue. And the other thing is, I don't see why. I mean, I do see why in the narrow self-interest sense. I don't for the companies, but in theory, let this consumer decide. You don't have. It's not as if stores have to choose between MasterCard and Visa and Discover. They can support all of them, and so let the stores support all of them. If people want to use their currency system over Apple Pay, they will. And the consumers will sort it out. But to have this NFC system already in place, and then deliberately disable it just so that people can't use Apple Pay, even though their system isn't even in place yet. It's like they're saying, oh, we're worried that people will come to like Apple Pay so much that by the time our system comes out, people won't want it anymore. And that's the part, it might fit their self-interest, but as a consumer, I find it annoying.
Not only that, Ted, but I guess it's sort of like a reverse judo thing. They've called so much attention to how great Apple Pay is by banning it here. Mm-hmm. It would have almost made more sense. I mean, there would have been a big kerfuffle, no question, but it would have made more sense if they had developed theirs, get it in place, and then pull the plug on Apple Pay. Mm-hmm. Then okay, at least you have that new system in place for mm-hmm. people to try. They're probably not going to like it, and I say that. I've read the same reports that you have about the workflow of having to go through making a payment with that system, and it doesn't seem nearly as smooth as the Apple Pay. But why they would try to leverage this now, it seems like it's guaranteed to get them bad press. It's certainly not doing CVS and Rite Aid any good. And
yeah, and like you're saying, it acknowledges how good Apple Pay is. Because otherwise, why would they? I mean, they could have just said, let Apple Pay exist. It sucks. No one's going to want to use it anyway, so why bother making a fuss about it? But that's not what they're saying. They're saying essentially, oh, this is so amazingly good, we have to stop it. And I'm not sure that's the message that they want to send to people. Oh, there's this amazingly good thing that you're stopping me from using? No, I'm not sure I like that. And I also view it a little bit like what the movie studios did with Ultraviolet. Where it used to be that you'd go to buy a Blu-ray DVD for the 3 people that still do that, and it would come with a digital download from iTunes, which I sort of liked because then again it makes it convenient for me. I was already using iTunes for my movies, so it would just be another movie that I'd add to my iTunes library. But the studios apparently didn't like that Apple was having control of it and getting a cut of it or whatever. So they made their own Ultraviolet system where you now download movies, and it doesn't work with Apple. In theory, iTunes could support Ultraviolet, but I think Apple doesn't want it to. I'm sure the studios would be happy if they did, but Apple's content to have its way of doing it. And so in the meantime, you now have to search around for some other app that supports Ultraviolet and have a totally separate way of downloading movies that is not overlapping with your iTunes method, and it's less, I assure you from this I have used many times, less convenient than iTunes by a good measure, and just so that the studios can maintain their control of it. And Again, if I was in a movie studio, I probably would be sympathetic. Do I want Apple controlling my business to some extent? No, I suppose not. But you know, maybe at some level you have to give up a little control for the sake of the consumer. But so far, a lot of these businesses don't see it that way.
I don't think that Apple has the perfect solution to everything. It's just that they always seem to have a very, very, very good solution to whatever they kind of aim at. And so I'm waiting for someone to figure out that they need to out Apple. They need to hire the designers. They need to think out. I mean, sorry, it's a worn phrase, but think outside the box. Think about, okay, let's not just do the next iteration, but let's try to leapfrog how this goes. Because Apple seems to be doing that in a lot of different areas. I mean, we started out this discussion by not completely understanding some of the hardware decisions, but when it comes to the software, comes to some of the new markets, it doesn't seem hard to understand. They seem to be doing really, really well in that.
Most companies don't do that. I agree with you. I mean, I go back to the original iPod as an example. Before the iPod came out, there were lots of MP3 players around. Sony had a system, several other companies had a system, and they were all of them seemed intent on proving that they were 1% better than everybody else. And so if your competitor's product was a piece of crap, to be blunt about it, your goal was to be a piece of crap that was 1% better. And then they would buy your piece of crap instead of your competitor's piece of crap. Nobody seemed to be taking the long view of saying, maybe we can develop something that isn't a piece of crap, that's really good. And that's what Apple did with the iPod, and it changed everything. And Apple continues to be one of the very few companies that is able to take that view. Everybody else is trying to just out-crap their competitors, to be blunt about it.
I think you just invented a new term.
Yeah.
I've blog post on that one, Ted.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Do a blog post on that. How to outcrap your competitors. Mm-hmm. I like it. I don't know. The one thing, though, to go back and say, how could it be better? I'm really anxious now seeing how well Apple Pay works with my phone, how well it'll work with the watch. Mm-hmm. That will be really interesting. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've gone down the watch route before, and we'll go there again eventually. But if they do what they were talking about at that launch event, that too could be a major consideration, that people will strap an Apple device on their wrist and use it for the convenience and see where it takes us.
Well, it'll be interesting for me personally, speaking of the watch. We can finish on this. I think we're getting to the end of the hour here. Yeah. To see my own behavior, which I can't predict yet. I can go back to when the iPhone came out, 2007. I saw Steve Jobs' keynote at Macworld Expo, and I was blown away. It was far and away the most knock my socks off, fall off of my seat keynote that I've ever seen. There were a couple of other good ones, but that was the best one. And as amazing as a machine as it was, I wasn't even convinced I wanted one right away. I had a Motorola track phone, and I liked that it was really small. I liked the flip phone thing that I could just fold it in half, and it would be real tiny, fit in my pocket almost to the point where I didn't know it was there. And here's this much bigger device with an exposed screen all the time that I have to get a cover for if I wanted to protect it, and I wasn't sure I was going to use all those extra features that it had. Anyway, let's not belabor too long. The point is, when the iPhone went on sale, I still wasn't convinced I wanted one. I didn't buy one on launch day. Within 48 hours, I became convinced that this was the way to go, and I drove to. I think Apple was out of them or something. I wound up going to an AT&T store in a mall somewhere that had them, and said, "Okay, I'm buying my iPhone." And of course, I've never looked back. I wound up writing a book about the iPhone, and it's now one of my favorite, all-time favorite digital devices. I use it constantly, so it's not the wrong decision. And now I'm in somewhat the same situation with the iWatch. As impressed as I am with the iWatch, I said, wow, it starts at $350. There have been reports that if you want one of the nicer ones, it could cost thousands of dollars. It only works with an iPhone. You can't use it if you don't have an iPhone in your pocket anyway. So it's not like it's going to be a substitute for my iPhone. if all it really, there's this voice in my head that's saying, if all it really does is make it so that I don't have to take my iPhone out of my pocket as much as I do now, is that really going to be that big a deal? And do I really want to work on a screen that's that tiny that I can't even that they now have to have me use a dial, where we're back to physical dials now on these devices because the screen is too small to manipulate with my finger and on and on and on. And so I'm saying, when the iWatch launches next spring or whatever next year, I'm not going to get one. I'm not planning on lining up on launch day to get one. I'm going to sit back and wait and see how it shakes out. And maybe it'll be 5 or 6 months before I get one, if ever. I might eventually get one just because I want to be able to write about it for my work, but that would be my only motivation. Am I going to change my mind in 48 hours and rush out and get one like I did with the iPhone? I don't know. We'll wait and see. But that's the part I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
And this reminds me of some of the discussions we had on Mac Notables back when the iPad came out. And, what's it going to do? How's it going to be? Is it going to be just a bigger iPhone? And is that going to be enough? And I remember distinctly having the position, that will be enough because of the extra screen real estate and what you'll be able to do with it. And, of course, it turned out to be a lot more. And I just have this strange feeling that the Apple Watch is going to be the same thing. It may start out as one thing, but I think it's going to morph into others. It's probably going to start out as more than just one thing, but it's just the beginning of something that is going to be interesting to watch and see how it develops. Sorry, I think there was a pun in there somewhere.
Well, and I can see that. I mean, I can see where especially I can see it working with HomeKit and Apple TV to just become part of some hub that you use to control your house. Without having to take your iPhone at all. So there may even be some ways when you're in your house and like near an Apple TV, for instance, where it could do certain things even if you don't have your iPhone with you. I can imagine that developing at some point. But yeah, so I could see that working. Maybe they'll get it to be you'll be able to install a lock that when you just approach the front door, your door unlocks, which they already have but not working through an Apple Watch. They'll have an Apple Watch that just allow that to happen. All sorts of things. Yeah, I can see where it'll eventually be very cool, but I'm still taking a wait and see attitude for the starting gate.
I want to see where the starting gate is before I make any decisions.
Yeah. But I can't imagine. I think we talked about this before. I can't imagine getting one of the expensive ones, if they're going to cost like $2,000-3,000. It makes so little sense unless you're incredibly wealthy. Given how technology advances when something is new, look at the difference between the original iPhone and the one today. Or even one from 3 or 4 years ago, never mind all the way back to 2007. That sort of advancement is going to happen with the Apple Watch itself. So when you spend $3,000 on an Apple Watch, and then next year they come out with Apple Watch 2 that's 3 times better, and you want to get rid of your $3,000 watch because you want Apple Watch 2, how much of a hit are you going to take? How much money you're going to be able to get for selling your used Apple Watch, and will it be enough to make it viable to do something like that? Or might Apple actually offer some sort of upgrade policy where if you trade in your old iWatch, they'll give you credit towards a new one? So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm with you. The only thing I will say is that I'm amazed at the prices and the extent that fashion drives certain things. Mm-hmm. And so you look at what it's just something simple. What some brands of sneakers go for. Yeah. They're sneakers, for crying out loud.
It's been $500 on a pair of jeans.
Yeah, exactly. So but because somebody put their name on them, and you want to be like them, or that's what's cool, and that's what mm-hmm. everybody needs to be doing. I don't know. And if it's a gold Apple Watch, if it's a gold watch, there are plenty of things here that don't apply to you or to me, but they apply to a lot of people, and it will be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, but if I spend $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 on a Rolex watch, I'd expect to, pass it on to my kid when I die. You don't expect that from an Apple Watch. It's just different.
Yeah, I agree. But I also don't think that the Rolex thing is, I was about to say rational. That's not the right word. It's just, it's a whole different set of values. You're not buying a Rolex because it's a watch. You're buying a Rolex because it's a Rolex. And that's all. I don't have a Rolex. Do you?
No.
No.
But I did embarrass myself once over the Rolex.
Oh, okay. We'll end with this. This I want to hear.
It involves people that most people listening to this will know. Maybe I was having dinner with the Mac Observer people, Brian Chafin, Dave Hamilton, Jeff Gamet, once a long time ago. This was many years ago. And the subject of watches came up. And Brian sort of egged me on. You could see where this was going. And to spout off on my attitude towards expensive watches. And I basically said, I don't get it. I mean, it's not as if they keep more accurate time. I mean, you can get a watch for $100 that keeps just as good time as a watch that costs $5,000. And they can look pretty nice. You can spend $500 and get an excellent watch that looks nice and lasts a long time. And why anybody would spend thousands of dollars to get a Rolex or something like that, I can't imagine why that would be. And, of course, Dave Hamilton had a Rolex and was very much into those sort of watches, and he's sitting there waiting for me to finish my conversation as I dig a bigger and bigger hole for myself. So, yes, that was not a happy conversation, but we still remain friends after that.
Yeah, no, I've been there. I've been there. I've had that discussion over jewelry with members of the fairer sex. It's like, I don't get it. It's just, you can't tell the difference between this and glass. What's the point? And that doesn't go down well either.
But at least you know what you're getting into when you're doing that. Yeah. I wasn't aware where I was going at all.
Yeah. You only make that mistake once, and then you learn. Hey, Ted, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for being here and spending all this time and analyzing everything. And I hope that you get all your little Yosemite problems worked out so that next time when you come back, everything's just humming along smoothly.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, we will, for sure.
Folks, Ted Landau, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is Mac Notables on Mac Voices. As always, thanks for watching.
And listening.
And listening. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the Mac Voices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest Mac Voices news from our front page or at MacVoices.com/newsletter. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at BackbeatMedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.